Well, thanks everybody for giving up this beautiful, sunny, breezy evening to come listen to these fantastic people and get important information. So that's great. I'm just going to do a tiny bit of housekeeping. If you need to use the I'm going to do a little housekeeping as soon as I find my notes. So give me a half a second on that. Yeah, it's right on time. So if you need to use the restroom, you're going to go through that closed door there into a hallway. There's two right to the left. I want to recognize the Friends of Ilsley Public Library. All programming at the library, from infants up to people like me with the gray hairs, is all paid for by the money that the Friends raise for us. And right now it is solely done with book sales. So anytime you go to a Friends of Ilsley Library book sale, you're supporting us, or you donate a book that they can sell to somebody else, you're supporting us. They are currently operating out of the Methodist Church in Middlebury. That's where they're taking donations and holding the sales, which are the first Saturday of every month. Donations are, I believe, Wednesdays 10 to 12 or Saturdays 12 to 2. But not on book sale Saturday. They're too busy to be able to accept donations on sale days. So thanks to the Friends for financing this. Also, I see a couple of new faces. I'm just going to quickly tell you that we are upstairs in Mini Ilsley. Our hours have changed slightly while we're here. We have to, because of all kinds of laws I don't understand, we have to match the bank's hours, except on Saturdays. If the bank is open, we have to close when they close. I can come back in later like I did tonight. So we are Monday through Thursday, 9 to 4. Fridays 9 to 5, and Saturdays are 9 to 4, which is a little less than we used to offer, but we'll go back to full hours. We do have some coming attractions, particularly Julie Parker, who is 92, and her husband, who is 94, who are recorded as some of the oldest living married couples in the country. Julie wrote a book. They are both graduates of Middlebury College, class of 1954. They're coming to talk about Julie's book called Journey Beyond Despair. And the teaser is Julie takes readers into the abyss of psychosis, then recovered launches a quest to understand her dysfunction. Relapses lead at last to despair, but these setbacks have marked hidden progress and a stunning twist. Julie's search for meaning and Peter's devotion sire transformative healing, cracking the code of mental illness. And her tagline is, can mental illness be a gift? A little intriguing, I have to say. But, so at 92, she's quite spry, and I suggested we had a Saturday afternoon program instead of an evening, which is going to be July 9th at 6 p.m. Because I don't like to drive in the dark all the time. I love evening programs. Let's do that. All right, we are on it. She's spry. So we do True Crime Podcast Club. If you're into true crime podcasts, you can come listen to the one we're listening to and discuss it. And for summer reading for adults, I'm doing an author study. We're reading some T. Kingfisher books. So if that's anything you're interested to, stop me or stop in and I'll give you some information. It's horror, fantasy, dark horror, and dark fantasy. Because summer reading's when I get to have my jam. Oh, and I forgot the most important part. So we're here with Kalia Livingston and Jess Hyman. They're both from CVOEO. Kalia lives in Burlington and is a Vermont native. She currently works as the Fair Housing Project Education and Outreach Coordinator with CVOEO. Kalia graduated from UVM, my daughter did too, with a bachelor's degree in political science and sociology. That was a lot of work. Her past work includes various social justice and legal work, campaigning, and she is a housing scholar and advocate. So your questions will be well answered tonight. In her current role, she educates community members of fair housing laws, protections, and responsibilities through workshops and fair housing consultations. Jess is the Fair Housing Project Manager and Associate Director of Statewide Housing Advocacy Programs at CVOEO. Can you even fit that on a line when you have to write your occupation? Wow. Where she works with renters, counsels people experiencing illegal illegal housing discrimination, and oversees housing education programming. Jess is passionate about supporting healthy, engaged, and informed communities, and her background in housing and food justice journalism and community development informs that work. Originally from the eastern townships of Quebec, do you speak French then? Oui, oui. She's deeply connected to the Old North End of Burlington, where she has lived for more than 2 decades. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you so much, Renee. It's really a pleasure to be here today with all of you and to talk about housing in Vermont and Gather. So just a little bit more about CVOEO and our housing advocacy programs. So CVOEO, which is a lovely tongue twister, the Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity, is one of the state's 5 community action agencies. And we're an anti-poverty organization established in the 1960s as part of the War on Poverty. All of our 10 or 11 interconnected programs support social, racial, economic, and environmental justice. And most of the programming happens in the Champlain Valley region, so in Chittenden, Franklin, Grand Isle, and of course right here in Addison County. And the Addison Community Action Office is moving this week, and I don't know the exact new address, but it's moving from its old location on that side of town, moving down this way. And they're going to have a much bigger space, more, and especially a larger space for the Feeding Champlain Valley food access site as well, which is really exciting. And in addition to the work that happens in the Champlain Valley region, we also have statewide programs. And we have 5 programs that support renters, people experiencing housing discrimination, people living in manufactured home communities, asylees, and then we also have a rapid rehousing voucher program for families exiting homelessness, the Home Family Voucher Program. So all of the work that we do, is done by an amazing team of 14 people covering 5 statewide programs, all super passionate and committed folks, and we're all dedicated to making sure that everyone can have access to a safe and affordable and accessible place to call home, free from discrimination and harassment. And we do a number of things. On the Kalia and I, the Fair Housing Project, we consult with people who experience housing discrimination, and we do a lot of workshops and trainings. And then we also work with community groups that are looking to increase the amount of affordable, inclusive housing in their communities. And so today we're really excited to be talking to you about some of these housing issues and how they relate to Kenneth Caddo's book, Gather. And so throughout our talk, we'll be using some examples from Gather, but you don't have to have read the book to engage in the conversation. Just a quick show of hands, how many people here have read the book? So most, but not all. And it is a really lovely book. It's really nicely written. It has a good flow. It's a fairly quick and easy read, and paints a good picture of some of the housing and homelessness and substance abuse issues that are here in Vermont. And so we're going to highlight how some of the themes of Gather illustrate Vermont's housing challenges. And we'll talk a little bit about Vermont's housing landscape and what's going on statewide and right here in Addison County. And we'll have a discussion as well. And so this is being filmed. Thank you so much for sharing this with the world. Just so you know, we'll only be filming the presentation and discussion, the main presentation and discussion. Afterwards, we'll stop filming and for the rest of the Q&A and discussion. So if there's any, for privacy concerns, or if there's anything you want to talk about, we'll be stopping the filming after the talking part. Feel free to speak up with questions and comments throughout our presentation, and as I said, we'll leave lots of time in the end. So, as we saw in Gather, Ian and his mom, they're deeply affected by the lack of affordable housing that we have here in Vermont. We're in a housing crisis. We were in a housing crisis before COVID. COVID made it worse. And since then, we've been seeing a dire shortage of affordable housing. There simply aren't enough homes out there for people of all income levels, and especially affordable housing. And when we have a housing crunch like we have now, it disproportionately affects the people who are most vulnerable in our communities, and makes it even tougher for people who have traditionally been discriminated against or excluded from housing opportunity. Where there's a competitive market, we have increasing property taxes, which causes rents to go up. And in rural environments, there's even slimmer housing choices, because Vermont has one of the oldest housing stocks in the country. And so there are a lot of homes in Vermont that are not habitable for whatever reason, haven't been kept up. We also have a lot of larger homes where the families have shrunk, but are staying in the same home. So we don't have a good match for the amount of housing units to people. And as a result, we have an extremely low vacancy rate. So a healthy vacancy rate is usually about 5 to 6%, whereas Vermont has seen a statewide vacancy rate around 3% for many years. And it's even lower than Chittenden County, it's below 1%. Here in Addison County, it's about 4% now. And so that would mean for every 100 units of housing available, or that exist, only 4 of those would be available at any given time. Yeah. And so that really impacts people's choice and people's mobility. And then the housing cost burden is very high. So a high percentage of both owners and renters are paying more than 30% of their income on housing, which is what's considered to be affordable, and about a quarter of those are paying more than 50%. And so when you have a high income and you're paying 50% of your income on housing, that still leaves a lot of extra money. When you have a low income and you're paying 50%, there's not much left over for food, for health care, for child care, for recreation, and to fix the car when your clutch goes out. And it makes it really difficult. Vermont also has the 4th highest per capita rate of homelessness in the country, and was a shift. Just a few years ago, we had the 2nd highest per capita rate. And so there's a sort of disconnect between the idyllic Vermont that everyone imagines and people come from all over to visit, and the reality for a lot of people living here. And as our scenic and our quiet environment becomes more of an attraction for people from out of state who are either coming as climate migrants, as the rest of the country gets a little warmer and people are moving north, or who are attracted to the rural environment, that puts even more pressure on folks already living here who are trying to afford a home. It makes the housing even more expensive. So when in Gather, when Ian was at his neighbor's house, Mr. Collins, who's a realtor, and Ian is looking around at the real estate ads that Mr. Collins has, and he's seeing these big, beautiful, expensive homes, and knowing that it's not something he could ever afford, and his mother could ever afford, and there's this disconnect between the opportunities that exist and access to those opportunities. And so, let's see. And when we're talking about housing opportunity and the importance of choice, that's something that Ian was taken away from Ian and his mom, because they were in a home that they wanted to stay in. Ian loved the place, the space around it, the woods, his grandfather's tool shed. There are things that were so important to him to being in that place. And even if they wanted to move, they couldn't have moved anywhere else because they couldn't have been able to afford it. And the reality, unfortunately, is that many people are excluded from choosing where they live. And that has to do with affordability. It also has to do with the way that zoning works. And we have a long history in this country of exclusionary practices that basically force people of lower income to live in certain areas and give housing opportunity and choice to people who have more income as well. And the more affordable homes in rural areas might not be accessible. There might not be public transportation or access to jobs or other amenities. So I'll just talk a little bit about some things you probably all know about the Middlebury area's housing landscape. So there are, let's see, in 2023, there were 2,990 housing units in the town of Middlebury. And most of those are occupied, but there's 56 homes are vacant, so 2% vacancy rate. We don't know why they're vacant. It could be because of habitability issues. It could be just because of disuse. Majority of homes in town are renter occupied. 63%, which was a little higher than I would have thought. Yeah, 63%. Yeah, and so only 33%-ish are renter occupied. And consistent with trends that we see in Vermont and around the country, that there's a discrepancy between between home ownership and rent, and being a homeowner or a renter, and skin color as well. So here in Middlebury, most BIPOC residents are renters. And according to these statistics, which came from that housing needs assessment, 100% of Black residents of Middlebury are renters. So according to these statistics from 2023, not one Black person owns a home in Middlebury. True. So it's not true. Good. That's good to know. So,
I mean, it's not.
Yeah.
It might be two.
Might be two, exactly.
Okay.
So there's, and so nationally, we see that there's a much lower rate of Black home ownership than white, and in Vermont, it's disproportionately lower. So nationally, so in Vermont, the white home ownership rate is 74%, and the Black home ownership rate is 28%, which is nearly half the national average of 42%. So I'm throwing out a lot of numbers, but basically the point is that there's a lot of inequity in housing, and a lot of that inequity is along racial lines, a lot of it is along economic lines, and it's something that we see in the book and we see in real life as well. And we're not seeing homes being built at the rate that are needed as well. So the Vermont Housing Needs Assessment, which the state just came out with this past year, projects the number of homes needed to create a healthy vacancy rate. And we have a long ways to go. There's tens of thousands of homes needed all over the state to make it possible for everyone to have access to a home that they can afford. And that when we look at the housing development projects that are in the works in the Middlebury area, it's not enough to keep pace with that. And I'm guessing you see here the same thing that we see in other parts of the state, where there's some NIMBYism too, where when housing developments are proposed, especially if they're affordable housing, there's some pushback from the community. And the homes that are in the pipeline now are mostly single-family dwellings, because that's what communities tend to want to see, when what we really need is multifamily dwellings and infill development and more ways to create more homes so that everyone has access to it. So that's just a little bit of context about what's going on in Vermont, what's going on here, that set the stage for talking more about Gather and some of the issues that go into it. And I will turn it over to Kalia to continue.
Thank you, Jess.
And I'm also going to grab a tissue, excuse me.
Right by where you put your bag. Thank you, son.
So next I'm just going to get into a little bit of fair housing basics, and we'll talk about what fair housing is and what protected classes exist in Vermont and federally. So just to start, I like to ask the question, what does fair housing mean to you? Does anyone want to answer that question? There's no right or wrong answer.
I mean, if they could afford it, if it was like, 25, 30% of their income.
To affordable housing.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and there's a variety, right? Like there's apartments, there's single family homes, there's duplexes, and they're at all kinds of price points.
Mm-hmm.
Also that they have access to services.
Awesome. Yeah, access to this housing as it is affordable.
Well, if you're talking about economic fair housing, then like of course then you would say, in relation to your income. But if you also are thinking about like safe environments or clean environments, like, those are really important to everyone.
Yeah.
So that's also fair.
Yeah. Well, thank you all. I think those are great aspects of fair housing. However, there is a very specific fair housing definition which laws cover, and fair housing is the right to equal opportunity in housing choice, free from discrimination, whether someone is renting, buying, or financing a home. So in order to enforce fair housing laws or carry them out, there are protected classes, which if people have membership in these protected classes, they've generally shown to have historical vulnerability to experiencing housing discrimination. So these protected classes are in place in order to help those people enforce their right to equal access and opportunity in housing choice. So there are 7 federal protected classes, which include disability, race, sex, skin color. I should also mention that sex includes sexual harassment, so people are protected from any quid pro quo kind of activity when looking for housing, or any sort of harassment that they might experience from someone who has a position to helping that person get housing. Skin color is also included, as well as national origin, religion, and family status. So these are protected classes that have to be enforced in every state. And in addition to that, states can elect more protected classes. So in Vermont, we have 5 more. Well, we have 6 now. One was actually just enacted through the legislature, and that's immigration and citizenship status. But in addition to that, since we haven't updated the slides, we also have people who are in receipt of public assistance, gender identity, and sexual orientation, which are explicitly named through the Vermont protections, marital status, so whether someone is or is not married, age, and survivors of abuse, sexual assault, and stalking. So all people who have membership in these classes have additional protections. Some of them are very specific, like people who have membership in the protected class of being a survivor of abuse might seek specific protections, like needing to break a lease due to that abuse, or needing to add additional security measures in a space. Those are all things that would give someone of that class additional protections. And people with disabilities also have additional protections that are specifically named, which I'll get into a little bit later in the discussion. But who is protected under fair housing laws? I apologize that my computer wants to lock so quickly. Anyone who's seeking housing, so that includes renters, homeowners, people obtaining mortgages or insurances, and it also includes people who are already in a space. So if they are already in a rental dwelling, they have fair housing protections as homeowners as well as renters. And when do these laws apply? They apply to anyone in any sort of dwelling, as well as to the owners of a property, property management, anyone that's a part of a property management team, neighbors, homeowners, renters, anybody who's attached to housing as a whole. And it also includes advertisements and statements. So it's important that fair housing laws are applied when housing providers are marketing for housing, and also between neighbor to neighbor as well. Statements can be considered discriminatory under these fair housing laws. So here are some resources that people can reach out to if they want more information about illegal housing discrimination or if they've experienced them. At CVOEO, through the Fair Housing Project, we provide one-on-one consultations with people who may have experienced illegal housing discrimination, and we talk through the situation with them and help them kind of figure out what the best next steps might look like. And we also work closely with the fair housing enforcement agencies. So that would be Vermont Legal Aid, which I should name, we're not attorneys, so we can't give any legal advice, but we will refer folks to legal aid if it seems like they do need more legal support. And the Vermont Human Rights Commission is another entity that enforces fair housing laws. And in addition to that, there's also the Federal Enforcement Agency, which is the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So if people were to experience discrimination based on any of those federally protected classes, they could file a complaint through HUD as well. And the U.S. Attorney's Office for Vermont also takes on different cases regarding sexual harassment in housing.
Can I just, I'm curious, as our current political scene is cutting and decimating things, do you guys feel like you're under attack specifically? Do you feel like any things, resources that you count on are under fire at the moment? You do?
Yes,
Yes.
yes, absolutely. So, back in January or February, there was an executive order banning federal funds from being used for anything that promotes diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Of course.
That is the core of our work in helping people understand the importance of fair housing. So that was one blow. And we are funded, our program is up to now has been primarily funded through a grant from HUD, federal grant. And so we were told that we couldn't do those types of activities with the federal money. And then our grant was cut. We're part of a national lawsuit. It looks like we'll be paid some of our grant money until it ends on June 30th. But it's very clear that under this federal administration, there will be very little, if any, funding for fair housing, education, and outreach and enforcement. It's not a priority of this administration, and it has a direct impact on the services that are offered. That's the bad news. The good news is, as an organization, CVOEO is 100% committed to this work, and so we will continue the work and find other ways to pay for it because it's essential.
And I will also add that now is more important than I've seen in my life to be giving this fair housing education and providing it for people. And another thing that we do offer are fair housing trainings to any interested parties as well as to people who have experienced illegal housing discrimination and housing providers. So I think it's really important that people have this information and know how to access resources about fair housing in order to remedy experiences of housing discrimination that have already taken place, as well as trying to prevent them in a time where housing is so scarce and a lot of our funding for housing is under attack. And just some additional resources that we have at CVOEO. One of our housing advocacy programs is the Vermont Tenants Program. And through the Vermont Tenants Program, we have a Vermont Tenants Hotline, which people can reach out to with any questions they may have about navigating through a rental housing situation. And we also have some materials as well, including the Definitive Guide to Renting in Vermont, which is extremely helpful. It names all of the Vermont landlord-tenant laws about different rental housing situations. And just going through the table of contents can be really helpful to see like what someone's rights are about security deposits or making repairs. So we have that available online, as well as the illustrated version of that, which we may have some in the back, but both of these resources are always readily available online. In addition to those resources, we also have renters workshops as well, which we teach once a month live via Zoom, and we also have them self-paced online. So that's another way that people can learn of what their rights and responsibilities are under Vermont landlord-tenant laws and fair housing laws. And all of these resources are translated as well, so you can find those online. That's just a little bit about fair housing and more of what we do at CVOEO. And here are some other resources that folks can look into to just get more information about what's happening in housing around the state. And these slides will be shared to you all at the end, and we'll also give them to Drew, who will have access to disseminate this information if needed. So bringing it back to Gather, one thing that we saw, which was a very prominent part of the plot, was Ian's mother, Brandy, facing the challenge of her substance use disorder. And I should name that under fair housing laws, people who have disabilities, that definition is very broad. So it includes people who have cognitive, physical, or emotional disabilities, as well as people who are in recovery from substance use disorder. So in the book, we saw that Brandy was, of course, struggling with a substance use disorder and didn't have the capacity to self-advocate when trying to seek out resources to sustain their housing. We did see that she was in a short period of recovery and started to make some consistent money and develop healthier relationships with a partner as well as with her son, and just seemed a little more engaged in what was happening in his life before she reached her demise through a fatal overdose. There are some protections under fair housing laws with people who have disabilities, and they have the rights to request reasonable accommodations and reasonable modifications. So a reasonable accommodation is requesting a change to a rule, policy, or practice, and a reasonable modification is requesting a physical change to a space. So some examples of a reasonable accommodation could look like requesting that an assistance animal can live with a person, or that they have a designated parking spot. And it also includes criminal background checks, which are very legal and can sometimes be a limitation if someone has a criminal background from them getting housing. So with a reasonable accommodation, people can request that their criminal background be overlooked. If they are in recovery, they would be disabled by that definition, and that could allow them to still move forward with the rental application if their criminal background is due to activity from when they had an active substance use disorder.
And are there big hurdles to prove you're in recovery, or is that fairly straightforward?
That's a good question. When someone makes one of these requests, the housing provider should not ask for any details about the person's disability or impairments. They just have to make a connection between their request and their impairments. So it shouldn't be in question if the person is actually in recovery.
Yeah.
But I think they could also have other people who can advocate for them as well.
Yeah.
And just to add to that, so although the housing provider isn't allowed to ask what the nature of the disability is, the housing provider is allowed to ask for verification from a medical professional or caseworker, and so they can have that someone attest to the fact that it's a person with a disability, and because of that disability, they require the accommodation.
So as we see all across the state, excessive substance use is both a cause and symptom of houselessness. And pre-existing substance use can create housing insecurity, and housing insecurity can also exacerbate substance use. So we kind of see that in the book, where we saw that Brandy was in a period of recovery and seemed like she was in a place to improve her life and her relationships. And then when her son Ian started bringing up ways that they could access resources and sustain their housing, it seemed as though she just didn't have the capacity to do that, and had a visceral emotional reaction to her lack of ability in doing that, and feeling of grief that came with having to uphold a household that she kind of inherited and didn't really want responsibility for. But just kind of emphasizing again that addiction can influence a person's ability to maintain housing while also maintain recovery at the same time. So as I mentioned, it seemed as though she was improving, and then suddenly things led to her death in the book. And that's a challenge that we see a lot of Vermonters face. And it kind of brings into question, as I was reading the book, if Ian and his family had some fair housing education, could the son, as a caretaker, have been able to advocate for his mother in a different way, or request a reasonable accommodation regarding the back due property taxes? Could they have requested that a repayment plan is made, or things of that sort? And we also saw at the end of the book that even though Ian had experienced such trauma and such a traumatic situation, a lot of his community was able to come together and support him. So that was a great ending to the book, although we don't always see that in reality as people are experiencing these kinds of difficult situations in sustaining their housing. So I'll give it to Jess to talk more a little bit about community efforts in remedying this housing situation, and the way that kind of connects to how Ian was able to ultimately sustain his housing.
Yeah, and just an additional note too, the overdue property taxes are an example of how just one thing can push someone over from being stably housed to being unhoused. And there's so many things in our lives that could do that. If it's a car that needs fixing, a loss of a job, an illness, getting behind on taxes. And often it's not a huge amount of money that is taking people from stably housed to houselessness. And there are a lot of supports in our community to help with that, but there aren't enough. And they can be difficult to access, and especially now, there isn't enough money from the federal side or from the state side to help support some of these efforts. One thing that's a service that CVOEO offers is through the HOP, which is the Housing Opportunity Program, which is support to pay back rent, as well as sometimes a deposit in first month's rent for a new apartment. And there's a limited amount of money for that, and the person has to also show that they can sustain the rent once the back rent is paid. And there have been similar programs for mortgage repayment. So what can we do? So we know that we have this issue in Vermont. We know that there's a disparity in access to housing. We know there aren't enough homes out there. We know it's expensive. We know there seem to be more problems than solutions. It can feel really overwhelming. But there are things that we can be doing at both a local and a state level to change the housing landscape and to better support everyone in our communities, especially the most vulnerable and the people who are struggling. And I want to share just a little bit about what we've seen being effective on a local level, and then we want to make sure that we have time to hear from you about what your thoughts about the book, what you're seeing in your own community, and where you would like to see change happen. I wanted to share a little bit about housing committees. So we've seen a lot of grassroots work, both grassroots and municipally connected work, that's been really effective around housing committees. Sometimes these committees are a subcommittee of the local planning commission. Sometimes it's an ad hoc resident group. Generally, it's a group of folks who are interested in increasing access to housing, usually affordable housing in their regions. And these groups can increase public awareness about housing costs impact quality of life, about how housing access and lack of access can affect economic viability in a community, the ability to find, for employers to hire people, and working on ways to increase the amount of inclusive affordable homes. Some committees conduct housing needs assessments, look at municipal plans to make sure that they support housing, making sure that there isn't exclusionary zoning in town, and identifying ways to maybe add more accessory dwelling units, or change the zoning to increase the allowed density in a certain region. And so I'm curious to know what's going on in Middlebury in terms of housing that is working for you, and what would you like to see changed?